So, yeah, as I was saying, I've got this axe, and I've got kind of a color version of this and just a silhouette. So if you're testing out props, getting ideas for props, you can bring these alphas in. I'm going to import an alpha from my download folder. Yeah, I made some weird silhouette thing out of that. So you can do one of a couple things. You could drag out a silhouette on a plane, sorry, or on a surface, right? And you get something like this. Or if you hold Control, you'll have to set up the same configuration of a drag and then the alpha, right? And we get something like that. But you're sort of limited by the resolution here. What we can actually do really quickly is take an alpha, and if the resolution is high enough, this isn't a great resolution, but it's not bad. I can say, let's turn this alpha and turn it to a mesh. And it literally will take a plane. In this case, I usually want the alpha flipped. Generally speaking, your background should be black, and the area that you want to sculpt with should be, the area you want to sculpt with should be white, the background should be black. So I'm going to hit inverse and then do another 2 mesh. So it'll give me this, basically. Now I find whenever I do this, I often need to just sort of scale things down a bit. So this is going to be just kind of very conceptual. But you can also apply this to a more final mesh. So I'm going to just scale this down, and I usually like to shift to a side view. And I'll zoom out. I'm going to use the trim curve, because what it's going to do is actually cut off that thin plane. So I want to just draw out that curve. If it's off center, you just hit spacebar and hold it, and you can move the curve, and it should slice it. Usually it'll cut it off completely, so let me just try it one more time here. I find sometimes these brushes, this one in particular, if you're in symmetry, it will not work quite the same way. So I'll just turn up symmetry, and then it closes in, gives me a new polygroup. All right, so that's not bad. Now if you wanted to, you could start sculpting on this to get an idea of the mesh. So the other thing I may do, if you do turn on symmetry, your symmetry will probably go through the face this way. You can always go in and adjust it so it's on a different axis. In this case, if I go Z, and again, you can sort of see the pivots are off a little bit. So there's a couple ways to fix this. One is to go to local symmetry, which should identify the mass of this brush, and it still may not be perfect. So another thing I will often do is go to set pivot, which under transform will center my pivot. So it should be a little bit more centered. And if you still want to get better symmetry, you can go to geometry, and I'll do modify topology, mirror, and weld. And again, I'm going to go through the Z axis in this case. So it's actually going to mirror from one side to the other. Okay. So now, you could divide this or dynamesh it and sculpt. You can sort of smooth things out if you like. Right, just kind of touch it up a bit. So this is good, like I said, just to kind of prototype and get a feel for things. And you could sculpt out the rest. And if you're going to paint things too, I've probably mentioned this a bunch before, but basically ZBrush's painting system doesn't require UVs. It's based on vertex color. So the vertices hold the color. They act like pixels. So when I'm painting stuff, I usually go into skin shade or flat color. And what's interesting about this is we can bring in this texture, right? So I've got kind of a conceptual painting of this. So I can go to Texture, Import. It's my weird 3D faces there. So I'll go to Color, back to Texture, and I'm going to select that texture, okay? Next up, what you want to do is add this thing to what's known as Spotlight. So Spotlight allows you to just left click and drag, move your thing around. You can change its scale. And if I can get the view roughly matched, like so, you'll see this in a second. That's pretty good. So to hide that, or to basically get into painting mode or sculpting mode, if I hit Z, it'll turn off the Spotlight kind of adjustment tool and allow you to paint. And Shift Z will completely turn off Spotlight. So you can kind of Shift Z back and forth. Now, if you're using, I'll just go back to a standard brush and reset its settings. Now, if you're just brushing and then I hit Shift Z, if I take a look at the texture, it's actually going to put in the texture from the drawing. Shift Z again. Let me get my view set up properly. This is really a powerful way to get your conceptual art onto your model as texture, right? I'm just going to eyeball my placement here. For this axe, I would probably keep the head the same and just Dynamesh it, but I may, have to merge it with a cylinder to get that little cuff piece, and then probably, you could hand sculpt or take a cylinder and warp it into the shape, right? If you wanted to go beyond just conceptual testing. There we go. So I'm going to just zoom in as best I can. So what's great about this is that you can use the standard brush as a color brush, right? By turning off Z add and turning on RGB. Lately, I've been just using the actual paint brush, which is basically that. It's a standard brush with any sculpting turned off and the color turned on. And what's great about this, let me just quickly brush through, Shift Z, and it is projecting the texture onto the surface. So this is really, really fantastic, right? So Shift Z to turn that off. So there it is. And like I said, if you're using other materials in ZBrush, it will mix in any color information into the color. So I often like to view this through skin shade or flat color. Again, if the resolution were higher, maybe, or the quality of that were a bit better, that would be fine. But I can keep going in painting. So I can say, let's hit C to sample. So C will take whatever color sample, like an eyedrop from Photoshop. It'll take that color and pick it up, and then you can C. Yeah. So then I can hit C for this part and brush that in. And then if I wanted to re-establish, and yeah, by the way, you can go in and if you want to make the brush appear harder edge, it's focal shift, you take it to negative. So this is kind of like in Photoshop, right? So you see you get a nice solid line there. It's kind of like the hardness setting inside of Photoshop. So then we can, pick up those colors and quickly kind of re-establish them. And then if you wanted to, you can just touch up and paint those black streaks again. So I'll take the brush size down, switch my color to black, right, and then you can kind of redraw. Oh boy, what's it doing? Sorry, let me just get my flat back in here. Restore custom. Okay, flat. There. Again, I might just. Sorry? So I usually like to paint in either skin shade 4 or flat color. Not sure why. Yeah. My flat color is actually looking kind of weird for some reason. I'm not sure why it's displaying a bit oddly, but so you can paint this stuff on, right? You can re-establish these streaks and kind of keep it more painterly if you want. If you want to paint in layers, the layering system in ZBrush, again, like many things in ZBrush, can be touchy. So if you have divisions on the model, you have to be at the highest division level. If you're Dynameshing, you may lose your layers or it may stop you from Dynameshing. But again, if you're just kind of painting, so one thing you can do is explore like different strokes and then actually kind of like a Photoshop layer, adjust its opacity. I would suggest too, if you want something that's going to kind of feel and look maybe warmer, more appealing, soft gradients help. So one thing that's really interesting, if you hold Shift, right, Shift will smooth your mesh. You see how it can blur texture as well. So if you're actually wanting to blur or bleed texture in, you can actually hold Shift to activate the smooth brush and actually disable the Z add or mesh effect and just apply that softening to the texture. So there's a lot of ways to play with. So it's not going to affect the silhouette, the mesh. It's just going to bleed things in. And like I said, if you're doing color, instead of just going to black, let's say you pick this kind of blade color, hit C, and then I might make it a little more saturated and a little bit darker. I'm getting some weird things with my ZBrush right now. And again, you can also lighten your RGB intensity, so it's sort of like a lighter kind of a brush stroke. I think I've got some Wacom issues because I'm having this thing where like every fifth stroke is like super solid, but anyways, I'll have to adjust the drivers. So again, you can go and be more painterly with that, right? Another really interesting thing, and I mentioned this earlier with the building, so maybe I'll just smooth all this out for now. And I'll hit C and take a giant brush here. I'll just flood this thing. There we go. So you can also do really interesting things via masking. So I often just want it playing with some of the features. This would look better if it had like more of the full 3D detail, but what we can do is actually do, and I mentioned this earlier, you can mask by peaks and valleys, which again, if I leave this on flat color, I'm going to temporarily, you can turn off Polypaint. So Polypaint, like I said, is basically direct surface painting. Okay, so we can see the way the mask is affecting the object, essentially, and I'll just set this to white for now. So there's so many different ways to mask, as I mentioned. So if you want to kind of highlight some edges, let's say, you can flip your display around to this. So peaks and valleys is useful for that. Sometimes I'll go to cavities, mask by cavity. Again, I might exaggerate the blur on this a bit, if I can see it. Yeah, it's very faint. So you can mask by a ton of different ways. There's even ambient occlusion. The ambient occlusion, so it's finding crevices and stuff like that. It takes longer to calculate, but it's very useful. So again, peaks and valleys, we can play around with the settings. So in this case, now let me go back and turn on Polypaint so I can see it. All right, so now I can say, oh, you know, this is where I'm going to go in and sort of paint my, you know, dark streaks or whatever. So let me just bring up the intensity again. So you can kind of protect certain areas and sort of get in, you know, streaks that way, right? I'll show you on a mesh that has more dimension than just this sort of flat thing. So if we're even looking at like a, it doesn't have to be realistic, but if we have a mesh like this, by the way, some people ask, like, why does my mesh change color? Well, by default, this color setting is just meant to kind of flood the object automatically, but as soon as you put a brush stroke down, it sort of fills with that color. So if I undo, let's say I go to red and I brush, right? It's going to leave that down and kind of make the rest white. What I used to do, and I think it's no longer needed in 2019, I would just go to fill object with whatever my base color is. If you're wanting something like kind of Caucasian flesh in this case, we'll go to fill object. Now, like I said, this is vertex-based color, so you do need a high poly count. So maybe I'll just open up a Word doc here. So the idea is roughly this. If you are sculpting, you get 1,000,000 polys, right? That's 1,000,000, or 1,000,000, I should say, points. What are you? 1,000,000 points or vertices. So yeah, if we have 1,000,000 points or vertices, that is roughly equivalent to a texture resolution of 2048 pixels by 1024 pixels square. Why? Because when you multiply this, this equals roughly 1,000,000 pixels. If you're talking about digital camera terms, it's a megapixel, right? So when you go to 2K resolution, it actually goes up to 4. So if you're doing 2048, now it's just a rule of thumb. You don't have to exactly do this for everything, but 2048 pixels for your texture size, that equals 4,000,000 pixels. So I would want roughly how many points or vertices? 4,000,000. Now when you go to 4K, which is 4096, I'll just type square, pixels square. That actually equals 16,000,000 polys. You can see how rapidly, pixels. And so I don't always do this. I usually kind of get to the 1 to 4,000,000 poly range, and that's usually good enough for most color texture. But if you, like I said, if you're doing hyperreal stuff, if you're doing feature film work down the road, then this is kind of your ballpark that you want to work in. Now you can also, what am I doing? Points. So I'll use points and vertices interchangeably. For me, like I said, for your student film stuff, like you need to get to at least 1,000,000, roughly 2 to 4,000,000 is kind of the sweet spot to be kind of fast and efficient in terms of sculpting and painting. So like I said, if you're dragging out a stroke now, let's say I want to put something in here, or if I try to draw something really small, you see it's only picking up on the vertices. Now you can just send this out and do some stuff if you want in Substance. Substance will basically allow you to paint in UVs, but you need to create the UVs, right? But if you're painting inside of Zbrush, You do need to divide up the mesh. So I'll divide it until I get to probably at least 1 million, 2 million. I'm at 3 million now, right? So you can get very detailed stuff. And if you also go to drag and load in a texture, you can actually load in images as well. So you can also drag in texture. You can do the projection using Spotlight. Very easy tool. And like I said, if we go down to the lowest res and you drag it out, you just can't see any of that detail. So you need the points there for the texture. So as I was saying, I'm going to just go back and show you the masking options that we have. So if you go peaks and valleys, right? Let me just turn on flat color so we can see that. And again, you can adjust the range and redo peaks and valleys and keep playing with those numbers or the coverage. So maybe I'll drop this down a bit, increase the coverage quite a bit. Ooh, too much coverage. Peaks and valleys. So like I said, there's a lot of ways to play with that. You can do it by smoothness, mask by smoothness. And so what's interesting about that, right, is that, and again, we can increase the range maybe a bit. So it'll take a little longer to calculate, right? So you get this really kind of interesting textural quality to that. And what you can do, let me just highlight that color, and maybe I'll take just a slightly different tone. So if you want sort of tonal variation, oops, I'll turn off the texture and switch this back to freehand. So you can hand brush this in, or you can also go color fill. Right, so now you can actually get some really interesting kind of subtle textural variation. And again, if you hold shift and you turn up Z add, you can try to blend some of that so it looks a little bit more kind of organic and bleeds in. So I use a lot of this kind of masking technique. Ambient occlusion is really great, but again, it's kind of takes a lot longer, so I often just wind up going by smoothness, peaks and valleys, or by cavity. Cavity will kind of find crevice areas, and let me just go back to the flat for a second. Crank the intensity. Oh boy, let's see. Yeah, let me blur it a bunch more too. Yeah, there's not a ton showing up there, but so it can be really useful. The other thing too is if you're painting something stylized, right? So I've seen people kind of ask about that, and they're like, oh, I want to kind of, have these rough brush strokes. Well, again, you can start with a base color and then exaggerate with kind of chunky layered brush strokes. Right, just go with a more saturated or less saturated color. Maybe something that's a little darker or lighter in value, so you can get that kind of look. Yes. So yeah, as I just mentioned, like if you let me undo. Oh, I guess I lost my undos. Oh no, I'm on the wrong mesh. Okay, there we go. So I'm going to undo. So yeah, if you have a focal shift, it's basically going to fade the edges of the stroke. So you'll actually lose the edge of that paint stroke. But if you want to paint through an alpha or something, and you want to make sure your focal shift is -100, so you get the full intensity of that stroke. Now, something else that's interesting I want to show you guys, which is really cool too. So sometimes what I'll do is, let's say I want to build a piece of wood or paint my object first before sculpting it. Sometimes that's a really smart way to do it. So you build the base of the house and you put the wood texture on and everything. Bring it in. You can go mask by color, and you can pick saturation. So if I turn off Polypaint just so I can see what's going on, Polypaint, turn off colorize, set this to white. Right, it's actually converting the information in the Polypaint into masking data. So if I again go back to masking, you could try maybe by hue, which would probably be good because that blue will really show up. Mask by hue, and then I'll turn off Polypaint temporarily, so that's more just a display switch. Okay. So then I'm going to hold Control. Let me just reset my masking brush, and I'll just get rid of that masking. So whether it's a simple texture, or let's say you paint skin pores or something, right? Or like I said, the wood texture. Well, now I can take that alpha and push it out. So you can actually paint first, then convert the paint into texture data for sculpting purposes. So sometimes I don't do skin pores, or I don't do wood grain, or I don't do like rust and damage until I put in the texture, and then I just convert it. And you can either hand brush, or you can say, you know, there's two of these, I'll just maybe inflate them or deflate them. So negative for deflate, right? So there's some really amazing options there in ZBrush. Something else that people ask me, and that came up today, is that what happens if you have an object that already has texture on it? So the idea in, maybe I'll just open up. Do I have Photoshop in here? I think I might. You know, if you have an object that has UVs, you have to convert the texture to Polypaint to paint it in ZBrush if that's where you want to paint. I haven't bothered learning. I should learn Substance Painter at some point. I play with Mari a bit, but I actually kind of just like painting a lot of my stuff and doing everything in ZBrush. No surprise, I guess. But you know, you can kind of bring stuff in from Maya back to ZBrush, but you have to convert it, right? So ZBrush's main painting system is through the Polypaint setup. So the idea is this. Let me just switch to a brush. So funny. I still try to use like ZBrush shortcuts in Photoshop. So you've got, it's called Polypaint, right? So I'll just, oops. So Polypaint, right? Oh my God, Photoshop, why? Okay, sorry, one sec. So we have Polypaint, right? So that's basically paint directly on the model. You can, if your model at some point has UVs, what you would do is you'd have UVs. So we'll say UV-based texture, right? You can actually convert back and forth. The main thing with Polypaint is it needs high poly counts, right? To paint on, and this usually is low res when you have UVs, right? So what often this means is that if you want to convert the UV texture to paint, you have to divide it. And I'll just write HP for high poly, right? So then you can now kind of convert to Polypaint to update any painting. So I'll show you an example. I'll just kind of fake something. I'll pretend one of our classic demo files here, earthquake. So the way it works is that basically you need the mesh needs divisions. So if I just solo him, whoop, take his clothes off. If I go to the low res, this is his base resolution. And so what you're going to have, right, are these division levels. So at the highest level is where your painting and sculpting detail basically will live. And at the lowest resolution is where you're going to create your UVs and probably export. So inside a Z plugin, if you have polygroups like he already has, I can say, all right, let's go to UV master, turn on polygroups, unwrap. He's unwrapped. So fast, right? We take a look at, I can't flatten this because of subdivision, so I can work on a clone just to show you the flattened UV layout. It's not great, but it's not bad. And again, you can send this to Maya back if you want to fix UVs, but going back to the original earthquake here. So he's got UVs. Let me just double check that again, unwrap. So now what I can do, if I go up to the highest res, for baking textures out, you need to make sure, under texture map, you first set your resolution of what you want. So that's UV map, set the resolution. I usually work in 4K. And then for your film, if there's stuff that's really small or is background, you can drop the resolution manually in Photoshop later. So for texture map, I just say create from Polypaint. So it looks at my high subdivision, but applies it to the low res UVs. So what I'm going to do is pretend, I'm going to go Z this thing to Maya. So we'll pretend, I guess I haven't installed this yet, have I? Let's make sure my Go Z is installed from Maya. Okay, so I'll Go Z. Oops, I think it's actually loading Maya. It's going to take a second. So if, like I said, if you started it traditionally, you had a model that you built in Maya, you had a texture that you painted in Photoshop or Substance, but then you maybe think, oh, I might bring it to ZBrush to kind of mess around with some stuff or add something. I'll show you how that process works. So like I said, we'll pretend this is exactly how Earthquake looks, or where he originated from. And I'll reset Zbrush for a sec here. So just kind of reset to a sphere and reset my palette as well. So the process is this. You basically go Z, or you can do export import OBJ or FBX. That also works. So he imports, right? The texture's there. So what you need to do, like I said, is you need to divide the mesh. So we'll pretend he has no high res. So I divide until I get to, like I said, my 1,000,000 plus poly resolution. And then to convert it to active painting, because technically right now it is a texture map that is loaded. Okay. So the texture map is on. If I turn it off, you may not see anything. So with the texture map on at your highest subdivision, very simple. You go to Polypaint, Polypaint from texture. So it converts it to RGB must be on. So I'm going to turn on RGB, Polypaint from texture. So now this is truly on the mesh. And if I go into back to texture map, the texture map is off. So now I can paint directly on here, right? So I'll go back to my little paintbrush. Let's say, because I'm moronic, I do this sort of thing all the time. Boop. So fancy. So what you can do now, right? So this is live Polypaint data. It's directly on the mesh. I can go back to UVs because I still have the UVs because it came in with UVs. Go back to texture map and just say new from Polypaint, and you'll see that just pop in. And then if I go Z back, any second it should load. Or I think there might be a clone actually. Is there a clone? Yeah, there he is. Yes. There's kind of our before texture and after texture, right? So that's one way you can actually really work, I find, super fast with Zbrush, especially when you're playing with textures, concepting. You know, you can take silhouettes, and as I showed you guys earlier, you can do like building silhouettes. You can do all sorts of really cool stuff. So hopefully, I think you won't be too intimidated by Zbrush. The new version as well, I will mention, is fantastic. So, you know, even if you're just sculpting on a plane, I'm going to just do a poly mesh quick here, divide it a few times. So even without silhouettes. So I'll divide a bunch to get more resolution, delete lower. So you can mask a design of some kind. I don't know what this is going to be, maybe a club, right? And then you can just sort of polygroup that. So hit Control W, and if you hit Shift F, you've got this new group. So if you go to a move tool, I'm going to control click. When you have the move scale rotate tool active, you can control click on a polygroup and it masks everything but that area. And then you can control click and drag to extrude as well. Okay, so it's very similar to like going to alpha import in a sense. I can clear my mask, go to a side view, go to a trim curve, because that will basically cut the back piece off, which I don't want, the flat piece that's left behind, and close it. Okay. And then at this point, I would basically Dynamesh. So go to Geometry and go to Dynamesh. There. Right. And you can start kind of hacking away at this thing. Oh yeah, I think my smooth was disabled, so I can sort of smooth it out. Take all your brushes and sculpt, right? You kind of make this more of a wooden club, or you can, you know, just reshape another kind of object, right? So you can work really, really quickly. One other thing too I should mention, this little paint icon, if you have polygroups, if I undo a little bit, if you have polygroups and you want to keep them, because I think when I trimmed, yeah, there should be a back polygroup there. If this little paint icon is on, you will remove the polygroups. But if you're Dynameshing and you want to keep them, right, you go to Dynamesh. Turning off that little paint icon will preserve the polygroups. The reason that's important is that sometimes when you build something, so let's say I want to build something kind of mechanical. Okay, if I go to a cylinder, I'll just use, again, the trim brush, trim dynamic, slice here, slice there. You know, the mesh is not clean, but it's still pretty low res. It's a little messy. Let's say I want to just trim that to get a polygroup on the bottom, right? Or you can mask and hit Control W or isolate as well. So I can always just switch to select, isolate, and then Control W as well. But I still have messy mesh, right? The beautiful thing about ZBrush is the mesh can be in any state at any point in time. It could be disorganized as a Dynamesh. It could be sculpted with Sculptris Pro with a bunch of triangles. And you can convert it. And I think polygroups is the key to really getting good, clean mesh. So, like I said, if I go through a Dynamesh, right, keeps the polygroups. If I turn up Dynamesh and I say, you know what, I now want to Z-remesh this. We've done this a bunch already, keep groups. The new version, this is 2019, has detect edges. So for sharp edged objects, it can really do a good job of that. And I'll say, let's maybe drop the poly count down to like 1,000 and Z-remesh. So for me, I think the polygroups is such a huge key to getting really good, really fast results, especially when you want to go to low-res objects and get UVs done too. Because this can basically give me free UVs. Now, if it's still a bit messy, you can always, maybe drop the count in half and try again, or just keep it the same and try again. Now, if I undo, I want to show you something else. Yeah, let me go back one step. So if I have the model in this state, you have a crease function too, and you can crease, right? So if I divide this now, you see it kind of divides really badly, but you can apply a crease to polygroups. What that does is kind of adds a bit of a fake sharp edge, and when you smooth, it'll try to keep it sharp. So you can use this polygroups and creasing by polygroup, so that's geometry crease. And when you go to Z-remesh for mechanical objects now, you can tell it to detect those edges and keep creases and Z-remesh. And it's not always perfect, so sometimes you'll have to kind of play with the poly count. Sometimes I also will disable smoothing as well. But that looks pretty good, right? So if I turn off the smoothing groups, if I maybe adjust the poly count a bit, I usually turn off adapt as well because I want to get to a specific count. And then I'll go in half. So what's beautiful about this is it knew where the creasing was and it keeps it. So now when you divide, it stays nice and sharp. Or if you don't want to divide it, but let's say you want to go in, you can take a crease that exists. So under the crease menu, you can actually bevel the creases that are there. Also really powerful functionality. So when you divide, you get maybe a little bit of a softer edge, right? And I guess the final point to make about this is, remember, the polygroups, unwrap, done. And if you need to fix it, you can just go Z it to Maya, and then you can tweak it and go Z it right back. So that's kind of, I guess, the workflow in a nutshell. It's incredibly fast, and you can create a ton of stuff really, really quickly. And by the way, if you ever get any weird shading, this might be smoothing your mesh a little bit too much. You can just go to Mesh Display, and I usually do a soften harden on something more mechanical. So you get smoothing in the right spots across these faces, but not across these polygons that are on a different kind of plane. And again, if we hit 3 in Maya, Maya actually has, if we go into edge mode, unfortunately I don't have a fully working mouse plugged in right now, but if you double click that loop, and then you shift right click, if I can click properly, no, shift right click, there's the crease tool. And you can actually, I believe it's middle mouse click and drag, which do I have? No, I don't have on this. You can actually remove and add creasing as well in Maya. It responds the same way as the crease function in ZBrush.